In the golden warmth of the late afternoon, the sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields of the village. The air was thick with the earthy scent of dry grass, and the distant hum of insects filled the stillness. The village of Ngele, nestled near the vast African savanna, seemed at peace, caught between the rhythm of nature and the slow movement of time itself. Life here moved in tune with the land, each day marked by the sun's passage across the sky, each season by the rains and the harvest. Kofi, a 25-year-old artist, walked along a well-worn dirt path, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tattered pants. His shirt clung to his skin, damp with sweat, and his bare feet kicked up dust as he moved. The young man had been feeling unwell for a few days now, a persistent ache gnawing at him, slowing his steps and clouding his mind. He had tried to brush it off, but the discomfort lingered, settling deep within him, making it hard to concentrate on his work. Kofi had always been a man of few words, preferring to express himself through the brushstrokes he meticulously applied to the canvases he fashioned from whatever materials he could find. The world around him was his muse, the vibrant colors of the savannah, the graceful movement of animals, and the quiet strength of the people in his village. His art was an escape, a way to communicate what he felt, but could not articulate. But today, even the solace of his painting seemed out of reach. He had heard about Amina before. Everyone in the village had. The older woman, in her 60s, lived on the outskirts of the settlement, in a small, modest hut, surrounded by a garden of medicinal plants. She was known for her healing abilities, her knowledge of herbs passed down through generations. People came to her for remedies when the local clinic couldn't provide answers, trusting her with their ailments, both physical and emotional. Her reputation as a healer was matched only by the respect she commanded for her wisdom. Amina was not just a healer. She was a woman who had lived through the full cycle of life. Her face, though lined with age, still carried a quiet beauty, the remnants of a once striking woman who had seen much of the world and its challenges. Her eyes, dark and thoughtful, held the weight of experience, and her hands, though aged and calloused from years of labor, moved with the precision of someone who knew the delicate balance of life and death, health and sickness. Kofi had never spoken to her before, but today, driven by a quiet desperation, he found himself walking toward her home. The path led him through tall grasses and past fields where children played, their laughter distant and dreamlike in his fevered state. The sound of the wind brushing against the trees accompanied his steps, providing a rhythmic backdrop to his journey. As he neared Amina's hut, he noticed the way her garden flourished. Bright, vibrant greens mixed with the occasional bloom of small, delicate flowers. The garden seemed to radiate life, an extension of Amina herself, grounded and steady, deeply rooted in the earth. He paused for a moment at the edge of the clearing, unsure of how to approach her. The air around her home felt different, charged with a quiet energy that made him feel both nervous and comforted at the same time. Gathering his courage, Kofi stepped forward, his feet making soft impressions in the dry earth. As he approached, he saw Amina seated on a low stool beneath the shade of a broad acacia tree, her hands working skillfully to grind leaves in a small wooden mortar. She didn't look up at first, her focus entirely on the task before her. The rhythm of her hands, steady and deliberate, seemed to mirror the heartbeat of the earth itself. Kofi cleared his throat, the sound barely louder than a whisper. He wasn't used to asking for help, especially not from someone like Amina. His pride held him back, but his growing discomfort pushed him forward. After a long pause, he spoke.
I need something for the pain,
Kofi said, his voice barely above a murmur. Amina lifted her head slowly, her gaze resting on him for a moment before she set down her work. She studied him in silence, her dark eyes moving over him with the careful assessment of someone who had seen countless others stand before her, each carrying their own burdens. There was no rush in her movements, no urgency. Time, it seemed, bent differently in her presence. She nodded once, a gesture so subtle it was almost imperceptible, and then rose from her seat, her movements slow and deliberate. Without a word, Amina disappeared into her hut, leaving Kofi standing there under the tree, unsure of what to do with himself. The wind stirred again, rustling the leaves, and for a moment, Kofi felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, as though the world had quieted in anticipation of something. When Amina returned, she carried a small clay bowl filled with a mixture of herbs and roots, the earthy scent of the remedy mingling with the breeze. She handed it to him without explanation, her eyes meeting his as she did so. There was something unspoken in that gaze, a recognition of his need that went beyond physical pain. She seemed to see something deeper, something he hadn't fully acknowledged himself. Kofi took the bowl, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest of moments. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but it sent a jolt through him, a strange and unexpected spark. He quickly looked away, focusing on the remedy in his hands, his heart pounding in his chest. Amina, however, remained still, her expression unchanged, as though she had not noticed the moment at all.
"You'll feel better by tomorrow,"
she said quietly, her voice smooth and calm, like the wind through the trees. Kofi nodded, his throat tight, and turned to leave, but something made him hesitate. He glanced back at Amina, standing there beneath the acacia tree, her presence as solid and grounding as the earth beneath his feet. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite place. A strength, a wisdom that seemed to draw him in. He opened his mouth to speak, to thank her, but the words didn't come. Instead, he simply nodded again and continued on his way. As he walked back along the path, the bowl of herbs cradled carefully in his hands, Kofi couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. He'd come to Amina in search of relief, but he left with something more, a quiet sense of connection that lingered long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. The days in Ngala village stretched lazily as the dry season continued, the sun bearing down relentlessly on the golden savannah. Life moved at its usual slow pace, but for Kofi, something had shifted. After his visit to Amina's hut, he found himself thinking about the older woman more than he expected. He couldn't explain it, but something about their brief encounter had left an impression on him. The feeling was subtle at first, like a quiet hum in the back of his mind, but it grew stronger with each passing day. His health had improved as Amina had promised. The remedy she had given him worked swiftly, and by the next morning the dull ache that had plagued him for days had lifted. But even as his body healed, Kofi found himself drawn to Amina's small home at the edge of the village. He started with an excuse. He needed more herbs, or so he told himself, but soon it became something else entirely. His visits grew more frequent, though he couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps it was the calmness that surrounded her, or the way she seemed to carry the wisdom of a lifetime in her quiet movements. Or maybe it was simply that she listened, truly listened, something Kofi had not experienced in a long time. Amina didn't question his growing presence. She accepted it as naturally as she did the changing seasons, never asking why he came, nor offering more than what he needed in the moment. Her life was one of quiet routine, tending to her garden and her remedies, greeting the occasional villager who sought her help. She wasn't used to company, but there was something about Kofi's presence that didn't disturb her solitude. In fact, it was the opposite. His silent companionship brought a new rhythm to her days, one that she found she didn't mind. The bond between them grew in small, almost imperceptible ways. At first, Kofi would simply sit under the acacia tree while Amina worked, watching as her hands skillfully ground leaves, mixed potions, or tied bundles of dried herbs. He observed the way she moved, with a kind of grace and deliberation that seemed to come from years of practice. There was no rush in her actions, no wasted energy, only purpose. The days turned into weeks, and Kofi began to feel more at ease in her presence. He brought his sketchbook on his visits, though he rarely drew. Instead, he found himself captivated by the quietness of the space around Amina's home, by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, the buzzing of insects, and the faint scent of the herbs that hung in the air. It was a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of the village, and Kofi found a kind of peace there that he hadn't realized he needed. Amina, for her part, continued her work without comment. Occasionally, she would glance at Kofi, her eyes filled with an unreadable expression, as though she were trying to understand something about him. She'd seen many people come and go from her life, but Kofi was different. He was young, and yet there was an old soul inside him, a quiet depth that intrigued her. She sensed his need for something beyond healing, a kind of solace that went deeper than the body. One afternoon, as the sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows over the savannah, Kofi sat under the tree, sketching absent-mindedly. His pencil moved across the paper, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He was trying to capture something of Amina's essence, the way she seemed to merge with the earth, her presence as natural as the plants she tended. His hand hesitated, unsure of how to convey the feeling that lingered in the air around her. Without a word, Amina appeared beside him, carrying a cup of herbal tea. She handed it to him, her eyes briefly meeting his before she returned to her work. Kofi took the cup with a nod, the warmth of the tea seeping into his fingers. It wasn't the first time she had done this. Their exchanges were brief, but meaningful in their simplicity. They didn't need to speak to understand each other. As he sipped the tea, his gaze wandered to the plants growing in neat rows around Amina's hut. He had never asked her about her work, but now curiosity tugged at him.
What is this one for?
He asked, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. He gestured toward a plant with broad, waxy leaves that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Amina glanced up from her mortar and pestle, following his gaze. A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips, one of the few expressions she allowed to break through her usual calm.
Fever,
She said simply, her voice low and smooth. Kofi nodded, though he already knew the answer. The question hadn't really been about the plant, but about breaking the silence between them, a way to start a conversation that might lead somewhere deeper. But Amina didn't seem inclined to elaborate, and Kofi didn't press her. Instead, he returned to his sketching, content in the quiet understanding that had grown between them. The seasons began to change, the dry heat giving way to cooler winds as the first rains approached. With each passing day, Kofi found more reasons to visit Amina. Sometimes he brought her small gifts, an interesting stone he had found, or a flower from the fields. She accepted them without fanfare, placing them carefully among her other treasures. In return, she would hand him a cup of tea, or a new herb to try, though she never explained their purposes. It wasn't necessary. Their actions spoke for them, a language all their own. One evening, after a particularly heavy rainstorm, Kofi arrived at Amina's hut soaked through, his clothes clinging to his skin and his hair plastered to his forehead. The rain had caught him off guard while he was out collecting firewood, and instead of heading home, he had found his feet carrying him to Amina's. When she opened the door, she raised an eyebrow but said nothing, stepping aside to let him in. Inside, the air was warm, the scent of dried herbs hanging thickly in the room. A small fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Kofi stood awkwardly for a moment, dripping onto the floor, before Amina handed him a towel and motioned for him to sit by the fire. He did as she instructed, grateful for the warmth. As he sat there watching the flames dance, he realized how natural this had all become. His presence in her home, her quiet acceptance of him. They sat in companionable silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant rumble of thunder. After a while, Amina rose from her seat and began preparing a bowl of something fragrant, the smell of spices filling the small space. She placed the bowl in front of Kofi, her expression as unreadable as ever.
eat,
She said softly, her voice cutting through the quiet like a gentle command. Kofi hesitated for a moment before taking the spoon. The warmth of the food spread through him, a comfort he hadn't realized he needed. They didn't speak as he ate, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only comes with a deepening bond, one that doesn't require words to be understood. As the weeks turned into months, their friendship grew stronger. Kofi continued to visit Amina, and each time, he felt the invisible threads of connection between them tighten. There was no need for grand gestures or declarations. Their friendship was built on the simple acts of presence, of shared space, and quiet understanding. In Amina, Kofi found something he hadn't realized he was searching for. Someone who saw him not just as a young man with potential, but as a person with depth, with unspoken needs and desires. And in Kofi, Amina found a companion who respected her solitude, who didn't ask for more than she was willing to give, but who, in his quiet way, offered her the companionship she had long thought she no longer needed. Together, they shared the slow unfolding of life in the village, their friendship growing like the plants in Amina's garden, quiet, steady, and resilient. The seasons shifted slowly, and with them, the bond between Kofi and Amina grew in ways neither of them had expected. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but a quiet, steady unfolding, like a seed taking root beneath the soil, unseen until it burst through the surface, tender and fragile, but undeniably alive. Their friendship, once grounded in mutual respect and understanding, had deepened into something more profound, something neither of them had anticipated nor fully understood. The village of Nagala was small, and as with all small places, whispers traveled quickly. At first, no one paid much attention to Kofi's visits to Amina. He was a young man, an artist, known for his introspective nature. Amina was an elder, respected for her wisdom and healing. It was not unusual for people to seek her out for remedies or advice, but as the weeks turned into months, people began to notice the frequency of his visits, and soon, the whispers began. Kofi had never cared much for village gossip. He had always been somewhat of an outsider, more at home with his sketchbook and his paints than with the chatter of the marketplace or the banter of his peers. But now, for the first time, he found himself the subject of that gossip. He could feel the weight of it in the air whenever he walked through the village. Curious glances, quiet snickers, and the occasional knowing look from those who thought they understood more than they did. It wasn't long before the whispers found their way to his family. Kofi lived with his mother, a strong-willed woman who had raised him alone after his father's death many years before. She was proud of her son, even if she didn't always understand his quiet, introspective nature. But when the rumors reached her ears, she grew concerned. She called Kofi into their small home one evening, her face lined with worry.
Kofi,
She said softly, her voice gentle but firm, "People are talking." He knew what she meant, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue.
They say you've been spending a lot of time with Amina.
There was a pause, and then she added,
More than is proper.
Kofi felt a tightness in his chest. He had anticipated this conversation, but now that it was happening, he wasn't sure how to respond. He had never spoken about his feelings for Amina, not even to himself. But now, faced with his mother's concern, he realized there was no avoiding it any longer.
She's my friend.
He said simply, his voice calm but unconvincing even to his own ears. His mother's brow furrowed, her eyes searching his face. She knew her son well, and she could sense that there was more to his words than he was admitting.
Kofi, she began carefully. Amina is much older than you. She's lived her life. You're just starting yours. People are saying things that
She hesitated, then sighed.
they don't understand. And they're judging.
Kofi remained silent, his heart heavy. He knew his mother was trying to protect him, but her words felt like a slow tightening around something fragile inside him, something he hadn't yet allowed to fully bloom. His feelings for Amina were complicated, layered with admiration, respect, and something deeper, something he hadn't expected to find with someone so different from him, in both age and life experience. But love doesn't always follow the paths we think it should. It doesn't always grow in the places we expect. The tension between Kofi and his mother simmered quietly in the days that followed. He continued his visits to Amina, but with each one, he could feel the weight of the village's judgment pressing down on him. People stopped him in the streets, their eyes lingering a little too long, their questions thinly veiled beneath polite smiles. One afternoon, as Kofi made his way to Amina's hut, he passed a group of young men from the village. They were sitting in the shade of a large tree, talking loudly and laughing. As Kofi approached, their voices dropped, and he could feel their eyes on him. "Trying to see your old woman again, Kofi," one of them called out, a mocking tone in his voice. The words stung sharper than Kofi had expected. He didn't respond, keeping his gaze fixed ahead, but his pace quickened, his heart pounding in his chest. The laughter followed him down the path, a bitter echo that clung to him long after he was out of earshot. By the time he reached Amina's hut, the sky had begun to darken, heavy clouds rolling in from the horizon. The air was thick with the promise of rain, the wind picking up and rustling the leaves in the trees. Kofi stood outside the small house for a moment, collecting himself before knocking on the door. Amina opened it with her usual quiet grace, her dark eyes taking him in without a word. She didn't need to ask what had happened. She could see it in the tension in his shoulders, in the way his jaw was set. Without a word, she stepped aside, letting him in. The inside of the hut was warm, the scent of herbs and dried flowers filling the air. Kofi sat down in his usual spot by the fire, his mind still buzzing with the cruel words of the young men. Amina moved about the room, tending to her work, but after a while, she paused and looked at him.
They're talking,
She said quietly, her voice like the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Kofi didn't respond immediately. He knew Amina wasn't asking for confirmation. She was simply stating a fact. She'd lived long enough to understand how people worked, how gossip spread like wildfire in small villages like theirs. She'd probably known this would happen before Kofi had even realized it himself. After a long silence, Kofi finally spoke.
I don't care.
He said, though the weight in his voice betrayed the lie. Amina didn't respond. She simply watched him, her gaze steady, waiting for him to find the words he couldn't quite form.
I don't care what they think.
He repeated, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Amina moved toward him, her steps slow and deliberate. She sat down beside him, her presence as calming as the warmth of the fire. She didn't touch him, but her nearness was enough to steady the storm brewing inside him.
You should care.
She said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years of experience.
Not about their words, but about the choices you make.
Kofi looked at her then, really looked at her. There was no judgment in her eyes, no anger, just a quiet understanding, a knowing that came from living a life full of choices, some easy, some hard. She had faced her own share of whispers, of judgment, and she had survived them all, but she knew the cost. I don't regret anything, Kofi said after a while, his voice quiet but firm. Amina smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of her lips. It was a smile that held both sadness and acceptance, a smile that said she understood him better than he understood himself. She had lived long enough to know that love, real love, was never easy. It didn't follow the rules. It didn't care about age or circumstance. But it also didn't exist in a vacuum. It lived in the world, and the world was a harsh place, full of people who didn't understand, who couldn't see beyond their own narrow views. For weeks, the village's gossip continued to swirl around them, a constant, unrelenting force. Kofi and Amina did their best to ignore it, but it was impossible to escape completely. Wherever they went, eyes followed them, judging, questioning. Friends became distant. Acquaintances stopped speaking to them. The once welcoming village had become a place of whispers and cold stares. Stitches stuck them through it all. Their bond only deepened. The adversity they faced brought them closer, strengthening the quiet connection they shared. They didn't need to speak of it. They both knew the challenges they faced. Amina, with her years of wisdom, understood the world's judgment better than Kofi did. She had lived through enough to know that love, especially love that defied expectations, was always met with resistance. And yet they persisted. Each time Kofi came to Amina's hut, they found solace in each other's presence. They shared meals in silence, their conversations now a mixture of words and unspoken understanding. Sometimes, they simply sat together watching the fire crackle, feeling the warmth between them that no one else could touch or tarnish. Their love, though tested by the world outside, remained pure and strong. It was a love that had grown not in spite of the odds, but because of them. It was a love that defied the conventions of age, of expectation, and of judgment. It was theirs, and no one could take that from them. As the first rains of the season fell, drumming softly on the roof of Amina's hut, Kofi sat beside her, their hands resting close but not touching, the weight of the world outside momentarily forgotten. In the quiet, they knew that no matter what came next, they had each other, and that was enough. The sun over Ngala hung lower in the sky as the dry season drew closer to its end, but the heat of the village's judgment felt unrelenting. What had begun as whispers had now become a constant presence in the lives of Kofi and Amina, an invisible wall closing in on them from all sides. Judgment lingered in every corner, in every glance, in every interaction, or lack of one. It was the silent force that shaped their days, whether they acknowledged it or not. For Amina, the judgment was something familiar, something she had experienced in different forms over her long life. As a woman who had lived alone for many years, she was no stranger to village gossip. People had always talked about her choice to live outside the main settlement, about her healing practices that many respected but some secretly feared, about her independence in a world where women of her age were expected to be grandmothers or the quiet heads of families, not solitary figures working with roots and potions. But this time, the whispers cut deeper. This time, it was not just about her. It was about Kofi. Amina could feel the tension every time Kofi arrived at her hut. The weight of the world pressing down on him. He tried to hide it, tried to pretend the gossip didn't affect him. But she could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, in the slight hesitation before he spoke, in the way his gaze sometimes flickered to the ground before meeting hers. He was carrying a burden she knew all too well. The burden of being misunderstood. In the village, the judgment was palpable, though it rarely took the form of outright confrontation. Instead, it was quieter, subtler, but no less painful. Kofi felt it in the spaces between words, in the awkward pauses during conversations with his neighbors. People who had once been friendly now avoided his eyes, their greetings colder, more distant. The marketplace, once a vibrant space where he could linger and watch the world pass by, had become a place of hushed tones and side glances. It was as if the village itself had shifted, tilting slightly against him, making everything just a little harder, a little more strained. One afternoon, Kofi went to the marketplace to buy supplies, just a few simple items: reese, millet, and some vegetables. He moved through the stalls as he always had, keeping his head down, focusing on the task at hand. But as he approached the vendor he usually bought from, an older woman with kind eyes, he noticed a change. She avoided his gaze, busying herself with rearranging the items on her table, her movement suddenly stiff and mechanical. Kofi hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, offering a small, tentative smile.
I'll take some rice,
He said softly, his voice carrying more uncertainty than he intended. The woman didn't respond immediately. She kept her hands busy, pretending to examine a basket of grain. The pause stretched uncomfortably between them, a silence heavy with unspoken words. When she finally looked up, her expression was distant, almost cold. Without saying anything, she measured out the rice, placed it in a small bag, and handed it to him without meeting his eyes. The exchange was quick, but it left a lingering sting. There was no hostility, no direct accusation, but the absence of warmth, the lack of the usual small pleasantries, spoke volumes. It was as though he had become invisible to her, or worse, a subject of pity, someone to be avoided. As Kofi walked away, the bag of rice heavy in his hands, he felt a deep sense of isolation. The village that had once been his home now felt foreign, as if he were a stranger walking through its familiar streets. The whispers were no longer just rumors. They had become a part of the fabric of his life, woven into every interaction, every glance. And though no one had openly condemned him, the judgment was there, lingering just beneath the surface. At home, things weren't much easier. His mother, though she loved him dearly, had grown increasingly distant since the gossip had reached her ears. She didn't say much, but her silence was heavy, laden with disapproval. Kofi could feel her disappointment in the way she avoided talking about Amina, in the way she would glance at him during meals, as if searching for the son she once knew, but now no longer understood. One evening, as they sat in silence at the dinner table, his mother finally spoke.
Kofi,
She began, her voice soft but firm.
you know what people are saying.
Kofi didn't look up. He focused on the bowl of food in front of him, stirring the rice with his spoon but not eating.
They're saying things that
She hesitated, as if trying to find the right words.
are hard to ignore.
He said nothing, letting her words hang in the air between them. There was nothing new in what she was saying. He had heard it all before, felt it in the looks and the whispers, but hearing it from his mother made it real in a way that nothing else had.
They don't understand.
She continued, her voice growing more strained.
You're young, Kofi. You have your whole life ahead of you. But Amina, she's lived hers.
Kofi's grip tightened around the spoon, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He knew she was trying to protect him, trying to guide him toward a path that would be easier, one that would lead him away from the judgment and the whispers. But the more she spoke, the more he felt the walls closing in around him.
I know you care for her,
His mother said after a long pause.
but people won't accept it.
Kofi finally looked up, meeting his mother's eyes for the first time. There was no anger in his gaze, only a deep sadness, a weariness that came from months of carrying the weight of everyone else's opinions. His mother saw it too, and for a moment her expression softened, but the moment passed quickly, and she lowered her gaze, her silence speaking louder than any words. In the days that followed, Kofi found himself withdrawing further from the village. He stopped lingering in the marketplace, stopped visiting the places where people gathered. The judgment had become too much, too heavy to bear. Even when people didn't say anything outright, their silence was enough. It was as if he had become a shadow, moving through the village unnoticed, unwelcome. Amina, too, felt the weight of the village's disapproval. Though she had long since stopped caring what others thought of her, the judgment was different now. It wasn't just about her. It was about Kofi. She could see the toll it was taking on him, the way it wore him down little by little. Each time he came to visit, she could sense the heaviness in his steps, the way his once bright spirit had dimmed. She had lived through many things in her life: loss, heartache, disappointment. But this was different. This was a love she had never expected to find, a connection she hadn't anticipated. And now it was being threatened by the very people who had once respected her. The irony was not lost on her, but Amina remained strong. She knew that love, real love, was worth fighting for even in the face of judgment. And so she continued her work, tending to her garden, making her remedies, and welcoming Kofi with the same quiet grace she always had. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the savannah, Kofi arrived at Amina's hut. He looked tired, more worn down than usual. He didn't say much as he sat by the fire, his eyes distant, his thoughts far away. Amina watched him for a long time, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she couldn't protect him from the world outside. She had always been strong, had always faced judgment with a quiet resilience. But seeing Kofi like this, she realized that the burden of facing judgment was harder when it wasn't just her own to bear. She didn't speak, didn't try to comfort him with words. Instead, she sat beside him, her presence steady and grounding, as it always had been. In the silence, they shared a quiet understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement of the struggle they were facing together. The world outside may have judged them, may have whispered and gossiped, but in that moment, in the warmth of Amina's hut, they were safe. And that, for now, was enough. As the rains had come and gone, leaving the village of Ngala awash in a vibrant green, the savannah reborn after the long dry season, the air was cooler now, fresh with the scent of damp earth and growing things. Life in the village slowly returned to its rhythm, but for Kofi and Amina, the weight of the world had not lessened. The judgment of their relationship still lingered in every interaction, every look. Yet beneath that, something else had taken root, something deeper, stronger. A quiet resolve had grown between them, fed by the very adversity they faced. Kofi had changed over the months. The lightness that once defined his spirit had dimmed, not extinguished, but altered. The village's judgment had left its mark on him, a quiet scar that only Amina seemed to see, but he did not retreat. If anything, his connection to Amina had only deepened, as though the pressure from the outside world had forged something unbreakable between them. His visits to her hut continued, as frequent as ever, though now they were no longer just escapes from the world. They had become something more, a refuge, a sanctuary where the burdens of judgment melted away in the quiet peace of her company. He no longer hesitated at her door, no longer glanced over his shoulder to see if anyone was watching. Instead, he approached her home with a quiet determination, a sense of purpose that he had never fully realized before. Amina, for her part, remained the steady presence she had always been. Though the weight of the village's disapproval hung in the air, she never spoke of it. She didn't need to. Her actions, her quiet strength, were enough to remind Kofi that they were in this together, that no matter how heavy the judgment of the world outside, they had each other. And in that, they found their strength. And one afternoon, as Kofi arrived at Amina's hut, He was struck by the sense of stillness that surrounded her home. The air was thick with the quiet hum of insects, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the distant call of birds. It was a peaceful scene, one that seemed to exist outside of time, untouched by the chaos of the village beyond. As he approached the garden, he saw Amina kneeling by the herbs, her hands gently tending to the plants, her movements slow and deliberate. She stood for a moment, watching her. There was something about the way she worked, something that had always fascinated him. She moved with such care, such precision, as though every plant, every leaf, was a part of some larger, unseen pattern. Her connection to the earth was something he admired, something he longed to understand in the way she did. Amina didn't look up as Kofi approached, but she knew he was there. She always knew. Without pausing in her work, she gestured for him to join her. He moved quietly, sitting down beside her, the soft earth cool beneath him. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the gentle rustling of the plants and the faint breeze that whispered through the trees. Kofi watched her hands as she worked, the way they moved with a practiced ease, the way her fingers seemed to know exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly when to release. There was a grace in her movements that he had never quite seen in anyone else. It was as if her hands carried the wisdom of the earth itself. For a while, he simply watched, content to be near her, to share in the quiet rhythm of her work. It was in these moments of silence that he felt the depth of their connection most strongly. Words were unnecessary between them. Their bond had grown beyond the need for explanation or conversation. It existed in the spaces between actions, in the quiet understanding that came from simply being together. After a while, Amina paused in her work and sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on a cloth. She didn't speak, but her gaze found Kofi's, and in that look, there was a world of unspoken understanding. She knew what he was thinking, what he was feeling. She always did. Kofi didn't say anything in return. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached out and took her hand in his, their fingers entwining in a gesture that was as natural as breathing. There was no need for words in that moment. The simple act of holding her hand was enough to remind him that they were stronger together, that the world outside, with all its judgments and whispers, could not touch what they had built between them. For months, Kofi had struggled with the weight of the village's judgment. He had felt its pressure in every interaction, had seen it in the eyes of his neighbors, his friends, even his own family. But here, with Amina, all of that faded away. In her presence, he felt lighter, freer. The judgment of the world seemed distant, almost insignificant in comparison to the quiet strength they found in each other. The village could judge them all it wanted. It could whisper and gossip. It could turn its back on them. But it couldn't take away the bond they had forged. It couldn't touch the quiet moments they shared, the understanding that ran deeper than words. In a world that sought to tear them apart, they had found something unbreakable. As the weeks passed, Kofi and Amina's relationship became a quiet rebellion against the forces that sought to divide them. They didn't speak of it openly, didn't confront the judgment head-on. Instead, they resisted in their own way, by simply being together, by continuing to care for one another despite the disapproval of those around them. In the quiet moments they shared, Kofi found a new kind of strength. It was not the loud, forceful strength that came from defiance or anger. It was a quieter, more resilient strength, one that came from knowing that no matter what the world threw at them, they would face it together. The village continued to whisper, to judge, but Kofi and Amina had grown beyond that. They had built a world of their own, one that existed in the quiet moments between them, in the shared looks and the simple acts of kindness that spoke more than words ever could. They had found a refuge in each other, a place where the noise of the world could not reach them. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting a warm golden light over the savannah, Kofi and Amina sat together outside her hut. The air was cool, the scent of the earth rich and comforting. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The silence between them was enough. Kofi gazed out at the horizon, his hand still holding Amina's. He thought about the village, about the people who had once been his friends, about the life he had once known. It all seemed so far away now, as though it belonged to another person, another time. His world had changed, had narrowed to this small, quiet place beside Amina. And in that he had found a kind of The judgment of the village no longer mattered. It no longer held power over him. What mattered was the quiet strength he had found in Amina, the way their love had grown in the face of adversity. Together, they had weathered the storm, and now, as the sun set on another day, they were still standing. There would be more challenges ahead, Kofi knew. The world would not suddenly accept them, would not suddenly change its views. But that was all right. He had found something stronger than the world's judgment, something that could not be shaken by the opinions of others. He had found Amina, and in her, he had found a strength that would carry them both through whatever came next. As the light faded and the stars began to appear in the sky, Kofi looked over at Amina. She was gazing out at the horizon, her face calm, her eyes thoughtful. He squeezed her hand gently, and she looked over at him, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. In that moment, Kofi knew that they would be all right. They had each other, and that was enough. The world outside could judge, could whisper, could turn its back on them. But here, in the quiet space they had built together, they were untouchable, and that, more than anything, gave them the strength to keep going. The passage of time in Agala was marked by the changing seasons, by the rains that swept across the savannah, and the dry winds that followed in their wake. Life moved in cycles, and yet for Kofi and Amina, time felt different, stretched, elongated, as if their love existed outside the rhythm of the village, beyond the ebb and flow of ordinary life. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still, their bond remained, quietly enduring the trials that the world had placed before them. The village had not forgotten them. The judgment had not disappeared. The whispers continued, though they had grown softer with time. The sharpness of gossip dulled by the constancy of Kofi and Amina's presence in each other's lives. The villagers still watched them with curious eyes, still wondered at the connection between the young artist and the much older healer, but the outrage that had once flared had settled into a kind of resigned acceptance. They could not change what was between Kofi and Amina, and in time, they simply stopped trying. But even as the village quieted, the bond between Kofi and Amina only deepened. It was not a love built on fiery passion or the excitement of new beginnings. Rather, it was a love that grew slowly, steadily, like the roots of a great tree, sinking deeper into the earth with each passing day. It was a love that existed in the small moments, in the shared silences, in the simple act of being together. In the mornings, Kofi would often wake early and walk to Amina's hut before the sun had fully risen. The path was familiar now, worn smooth by his many visits, and the village, still asleep, felt like a distant memory. The cool air of dawn brushed against his skin, and the soft sound of his footsteps was the only noise that disturbed the quiet. As he approached Amina's home, he would sometimes pause, taking in the sight of the small house nestled among the trees, its garden blooming with life, even in the dry season. It was a place of refuge, of peace, a world apart from the one he had once known. Amina would often be awake when he arrived, tending to her herbs or preparing tea. She would greet him with a nod, her eyes warm but without the need for words. They had long since moved beyond the need for conversation. Their relationship was built on something deeper, something unspoken, and in the quiet moments they shared, they found a kind of intimacy that few others could understand. The days they spent together were not filled with grand gestures or declarations of love. Instead, they were filled with the quiet rhythms of life, the tending of the garden, the preparation of meals, the shared moments of stillness as they watched the world around them change. Kofi would sit by the fire in Amina's small home, sketching in his book or simply watching her as she worked. There was a peace in those moments, a sense of completeness that neither of them had expected to find. Their love was a quiet thing, but it was not fragile. It had been forged in the fires of judgment, tested by the harsh opinions of others, and it had emerged stronger for it. Each day that passed was a testament to their resilience, to their commitment to one another. They did not need the approval of the village, nor did they seek it. They had found something that transcended the narrow views of those around them, something that could not be broken by whispers or stares. As the years passed, the world around them changed. The village grew, new families arrived, children were born, and the landscape of Nagala shifted. But through it all, Kofi and Amina remained a constant presence. their love enduring even as the world moved. The judgment that had once followed them like a shadow began to fade, the villagers growing accustomed to their quiet existence. What had once been a source of gossip had become a part of the village's story, a thread woven into the fabric of life in Nigella. The people began to speak of them with a kind of reluctant respect. They were no longer the scandalous couple that defied convention, but rather a symbol of something more profound, a love that had survived, that had weathered the storms of judgment and emerged strong. Those who had once whispered about them now spoke of their bond in hushed tones, as though it was something sacred, something beyond the understanding of ordinary people. Kofi, now in his 30s, had grown into his own. The boy who had once struggled with the weight of the village's disapproval had become a man confident in his choices, secure in the life he had built with Amina. His art, once a refugee from the world, had flourished, reflecting the depth of his experiences and the richness of his relationship with Amina. His sketches, once simple studies of the landscape and the people around him, had evolved into something more: portraits of life, of love. Each stroke of his pencil, each line on the page, was a testament to the life he had chosen, the love he had found. Amina, too, had changed. The years had softened her in some ways, but in others she remained as strong as ever. Her hands, though older now, still moved with the same grace and precision, her knowledge of herbs and healing as sharp as it had ever been. She was respected in the village, not just for her wisdom, but for the quiet dignity with which she had lived her life. People came to her not only for remedies, but for advice, for comfort, for the kind of understanding that only comes from a life well lived. But though the world around them had changed, though the village had grown and shifted, Kofi and Amina's love remained constant. It was a love that had been shaped by time, by the slow accumulation of shared moments, by the quiet strength they found in each other. It was not the kind of love that burned brightly and then faded. It was the kind of love that endured, that deepened with each passing year, that grew stronger in the face of adversity. There were no grand declarations between them, no need for words to express what they felt. Their love was written in the way Kofi's hand would brush against Amina's as they worked side by side in the garden, in the way Amina would gently place a cup of tea in front of him without a word, in the way they would sit together in the evening, watching the sun set over the savannah, the sky painted in shades of gold and purple. In the quiet of those moments, they found their strength. In the stillness of the world around them, they knew that their love was something that could not be touched by time or by the judgment of others. It was a love that had endured, that would continue to endure, long after the whispers had faded, long after the village had moved on. And as the years continued to pass, Kofi and Amina's love became a part of the landscape of Ngala, as constant as the trees that lined the horizon, as enduring as the winds that swept across the savannah. It was a love that had been tested and had emerged stronger for it, a love that would stand the test of time, a quiet, unbreakable bond between two souls who had found strength in each other. In the end, it was not the judgment of the world that defined them, but the love they had shared, the life they had built together. And as they grew older, as the seasons continued to change, they knew that what they had found in each other was something rare, something precious. It was a love that would endure, quietly, steadily, through all the years to come.